Hello, CRE 101 students, and welcome to part 2 of the screencast for Chapter 2, Ethics and Values, or Values and Ethics, from Becoming a Critical Thinker. So in our first screencast, we left off on ethical decision-making test number 2, the Universal Consequences test. So the third test covered in the chapter is the New Cases test. And it asks whether a decision is consistent with decisions that would be made in similar harder cases. So you imagine a harder case or a harder scenario or a harder consequence and decide whether or not you would act the same way in this case. So you apply the decision to a new case and see if the decision can still hold. The fourth is the Higher Principles test, and this involves asking the question whether the principle on which one is acting is consistent with a higher or more general principle that one accepts. And one way to think about this is an example of keeping your part of an agreement regardless of how the other party or parties choose to act or behave. And I believe the example in the textbook goes something like cleaning a house that you share with a roommate because you had an agreement that each roommate would do a certain part, and even though the other roommates aren't doing their part, you continue to do your part. So the Higher Principles test. So those are the decision-making tests that you should understand and be able to apply. And then lastly, the chapter goes over a method for discovering assumptions, which was developed by a British philosopher named Stephen Tolman, so we call it Tolman's model. And he approached argument analysis in a way that helped him and others isolate our assumptions. And he does this by breaking arguments into 3 core questions. One about claims, one about reasons, and one about warrants. So the claims question asks you to simply state and be able to understand what the statement or conclusion is being made about the issue, followed by a question regarding reason that asks you to think about what statements are being made to support the conclusion or issue. And then he uses the word warrants, which is synonymous with a lot of other words we've been looking at in the past 2 modules of CRE. And it asks you to think about the assumptions that need to be made to link the reasons to the claims. Are they logically connected, or are there problems with the warrants? And I believe on page 53 in the textbook, there's an example of having to leave earlier to arrive at an airport on time because the flight is at a certain time where the travel will involve rush hour traffic. So you break it down into claims, reasons, and warrants, and there's a couple of examples of that to think about arguments, and it helps us isolate our assumptions, value assumptions that we make, by breaking arguments down into it. So in summary, there was a lot in this chapter, and there's a lot in chapter 3 as well. In summary, this chapter has covered value assumptions, the ideas that underlie value assumptions, beliefs about what is good and important or bad and unimportant, the conflicts that arrive between value assumptions, that we need to address these before we can have a meaningful discussion, and that if we can't arrive at a meaningful discussion, it typically means that our value assumptions are so cherished that we're not willing to change them in order to have a meaningful discussion. We talked a little bit about value prioritization, agreeing on the importance of values and deciding on which values should be given priority in any given one controversy. And the idea that ethics are standards of conduct and that they reflect values, and that there are schools of thought that revolve around ethics, including libertarianism, utilitarianism, egalitarianism, religious principles, and prima facie values. And then we reviewed the tests that exist for ethical decision making. And prior to that, we also talked a little bit between the difference between real values and ideal values. Sorry, I jumped that one there. So ideal values held by an individual in theory, what should be the case in the world, versus real values that are held in theory but also carried out in practice. We can act upon them. And the idea that our personal ethics are revealed by our behavior as we advocate for our ideas and as we make decisions. Several tests have been developed to help people make ethical decisions, and they include the role exchange test, the universal consequences test, the new cases test, and the higher principles test. And we even have a model, a method that helps us discover and detect value assumptions and reality assumptions in an argument, Tolman's model, looking at the claim, the reason, and the warrant. So hopefully these two screencasts give you a better understanding of the specific details involved in values and ethics. And as you're applying this information, try and practice this throughout the week. Turn on the radio to National Public Radio, or go to CNN online and look at a controversial issue that's occurring locally or nationally, and listen to some of the arguments that are being made and try to apply some of the concepts just as practice before you get into the assignments and the quizzes and tests for this module. I hope this helps, and I'll see you online.